We've arrived at the Display tab, which is a great place to be because it gives us control over how things look within Grasshopper. I'm going to start at the Vector tab. I'm going to look at Vector Display. And I'm going to look at this because by default, vectors are not shown. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If I go to Vector, Vector, and Vector 2 point, I'm going to create a vector from 2 points that I draw. I'll bring these in params, geometry, and point. I'll set one point somewhere over here. I'll do the same with a second point, just move it over. I'm going to make a vector between these, between point A and point B. There we go. I have some vector. But as you can see, there's no display of that by default. I can change this if I use the vector display. I need an anchor point. For example, my first point can serve as the anchor point, then the vector I want to show. Now I can visualize vectors. And it's good to check the direction of curves or surfaces, or maybe even check the mesh normals. So there's a lot of utility, and I use the display vector quite a lot. We can move this around and always have the vector follow us. Let's look at a few other components here, point list and point order. Let me turn the preview of this off for now. Let's imagine that we had a lot of points here in vector grid and populate 2D. I get a grid with many, many different points. Let's turn down the points a little bit. So here in N, I'm going to right click, set integer to 10. So you follow me a bit better. What I'll do is I'll bring down a panel, params input and panel, and I'll put 10 there so you remember what I actually had input. And let's say that I wanted to know which order these points were in the list. I can go to display, vector, point list. I get a little number there, which is pretty hard to see. If we change the size input, for example, to 1, I'll do the same here. I'll bring down panel, remember with quotes, I can put a 1, enter. Let me plug that into the S input. Here I see that the first point is over here, then it goes to 1, 2, etc. I can actually also display a little bit more information. Here in display vector, I have the point order. So I can connect my points to that, and it shows me from here to 1, to 2, to 3, to 4, to 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So it helps me to follow along and see how points are organized within this list. Over here, we also have some components to dimension elements and to also tag things. Let me turn this off here for a moment. We have tag and text tag 3D. Let's start with tag. This is a generic component that allows you to add text in different parts of the document. It takes a location, the text, and eventually the color that you want. Let's give it a location. I'm going to go to params, geometry, and point, set one point somewhere over there. That's our location, but we need some text, something to write and draw at that point. I'll do a panel here, double click on the canvas, start with a quotation and say something like hello world. Press enter. Now we have the text that we want to display there. Plug that into T. Let's change the color because we can. I'll go to params input color swatch. Notice that we have a little tag that's kind of a billboard. It's always aligned to the camera. It always says hello world aligned to the camera. If I bake this, select it and right click on the canvas and say bake, that bakes to a dot in Rhino. What if we wanted a little bit more control, for example, over the size and maybe the orientation of that? I have display dimensions and text tag 3D. I'm going to copy these elements and turn off the preview of tag. So I'll select tag, right click, preview off. I'm going to use some of these inputs, so I'm going to copy them. And I'll bring down another point. Params, geometry, and point. Set one point. Now the location of the text tag 3D takes actually a construction plane. I could have something like this. Here's my point, here's my text, and eventually my color. So I have this now oriented to the world XY because I only plugged in a point. When you do that, it's going to eventually just assume that point and the orientation is world XY. We can change this, for example, if we go to vector, plane, XZ plane. I'm going to plug my point into there, eventually the plane into the location. Now we have an oriented text. I can change the position, but it's always going to be facing based on what I have here in the location. I can also change the justification if I like. I can right click here, for example, change how the text is related to the location. When we bake this, we get just Rhino text. We can edit this, modify it if we want, or something like hello GH. That's a good way to bring text in all sorts of different orientations in Rhino. Let me turn the preview off and see what else we have in display. One thing that you might have noticed is that all of the objects show up with your preview colors. So if I have here, for example, a surface primitive sphere, which is now closer to 000, if I don't have the component selected, it's gray. And if I select it, it's magenta. This is because we've changed our preview colors. Remember, you can do that by right-clicking on the canvas, going to Preferences, eventually going to Viewport, and changing your colors there. Since we've already done that, my sphere either shows up magenta or gray. What if that was a very special sphere and you wanted colored something else? Here in Display, we have the Preview area, which gives us a custom preview. I'm going to use that. I'll plug my geometry there. It turns pink. Why does it do that? Let me turn off my original sphere. In S, we have the option to introduce a material or a shader. In this case, it has some default material that is shaded pink. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the preview settings for the mesh so it's high quality. And this is here on the canvas toolbar. We switch to high quality. Let's see if we can affect that shader by creating a different color. Here in Display Color, we can actually show, for example, color RGB. I'm going to plug in this color into S. And it's taken actually a floating point value. So I can just use the params input and slider. And if I connect the same slider to all of them, we'll get kind of a grayscale gradient here. Here I'm just plugging in a color, but it's asking me for a shader. So if I have just a color, it'll convert it into like a material here. I can control this a little bit more if I go to Preview, Display Preview, and Create Material. Here I have the diffuse color, the specular color, and the emissive color, as well as the transparency and the shine. I could change the transparency here with the color in alpha, but let's just imagine that we're going to do it here with the material. I'll plug in the color to the diffuse channel, and I'm going to create a slider that goes from 0 to 1, params input number slider, connect that to transparency, and plug that into the custom preview. You'll notice that I can go from fully transparent to opaque. We can also modify, for example, the shine. This goes from 0 to 100. I'll make a slider that goes from 0 to 100. Now if I do that and increase the shine, notice that I can increase and decrease the shine. Let's say that this is an all white object. You can see how the shine changes there. A few other things that I have in display which are useful are these graphs. We're not going to use them too much at the moment, but for example, I can just show you one quickly, the value tracker. It's kind of a live tracker of value. So if I had a slider plugged into here, it would just start to track the values from my slider. That could be useful for some things. Finally, we have dimensions. Let's just try, for example, an align dimension. Let me go ahead and turn off my custom preview of my sphere. Show dimensions here. It needs 2 points, so I'll bring down a params geometry point, set 1 point, and params geometry point, set 1 point over here. I'll connect the first one to A and the second point to B. Now we have some dimensions. Of course, I can change the position of these, and the dimension is going to change. When I bake this, it bakes to a Rhino dimension. So as you can see, we have all sorts of really useful components to automate, for example, the creation of a bunch of dimensions, to give some specific colors to objects, to display vectors, a lot of really interesting things here in the Display tab.